Hi guys. I never imagined I'd be in a position where I had to confront Clara about the truth. Not only had I grown to trust her beyond the deepest level of my understanding, but I had convinced myself that we had it all together, a perfect life, a perfect marriage. But as everything began to unravel, I realized just how deep Oliver's manipulation ran, and how far I had been kept in the dark. It started innocently enough, just a few passing comments here and there from Clara, things I shrugged off at first. But as I saw her growing more distant, more withdrawn, and caught in the haze of confusion, I started paying attention to the inconsistencies. Clara had always been the more intuitive one between us. She picked up on everything, body language, subtle shifts in tone, and yet there were moments when she had missed things that were glaringly obvious. One Saturday evening, Clara and I had made plans to spend time together. We'd been so caught up in the busyness of life, work, family commitments, that we'd hardly had any time just for ourselves. But then, out of nowhere, Oliver called her, asking if she could meet with him on the weekend to discuss an urgent matter. I remember watching her face as she hesitated. Clara wasn't the type of person to drop everything for just anyone, but Oliver? He had a way of making people feel needed. Needed, even if the needs were entirely self-serving. I didn't think much of it at the time. Clara told me it was just business. Oliver needed her expertise with something, and I trusted her judgment. But when I started paying attention to how often these urgent matters cropped up, something didn't sit right with me. Every weekend, every Friday night, Oliver was calling her, asking her to stay late, pushing meetings and strategy sessions into late hours, and sometimes she'd come home late, often exhausted, her mood distant, not in the least interested in talking. I tried to ask her about it, but each time I broached the subject, she would brush me off with an excuse or a vague explanation. I didn't want to push too hard. I trusted her, I told myself, and if anything was wrong, she would come to me. Then came the late-night trip. It was a Wednesday evening, unusually late for Oliver to call, even for him. Clara had been on edge all day, barely making eye contact, her answers short and clipped. I didn't think anything of it at first, but when she suddenly announced she had to leave for a quick work trip to meet Oliver, just the two of them, I froze. "I'll be back by morning," she said. "It's important." At first, I let her go, trusting her, telling myself I was overthinking things. But as soon as she left, an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. Clara had always been open about where she was going. A work trip at night for a one-on-one meeting with Oliver, something about it didn't sit right. I kept myself busy with household chores, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of suspicion, until I decided to check her phone. I'm not proud of what I did next. I wish I could say that I hadn't let my emotions take control, but in the middle of my confusion and doubt, I couldn't help it. I opened her messages, scanned the texts. Nothing obvious at first, just routine work talk. But there were subtle hints. Texts like, "Can we meet at the usual place?" and "Don't forget the new plans, it's crucial." And that was the tipping point. The usual place? What was this, some sort of game they were playing? I knew Oliver had a history of pushing boundaries with colleagues, especially with women. I had heard rumors, but I never thought much of them. After all, Clara had always dismissed them, saying he was just a driven businessman with no time for distractions. But the more I thought about it, the more it all started to line up. The late nights, the urgent meetings, the special treatment, the way Oliver used her work to keep her close, to make her feel indispensable. It wasn't just about business. It was about control. By the time Clara returned that morning, I was already waiting, my heart pounding in my chest. "How was the meeting?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, though my hands were trembling. Clara hesitated, then offered a tired smile. "Fine," she said, brushing past me. But I could tell something was off. Her eyes wouldn't meet mine, and her usual warmth had all but disappeared. As the days went by, the atmosphere between us grew more strained. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something was happening behind my back. I noticed how Clara became more withdrawn, how her smiles didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. She was distracted, evasive. One evening, when she was on the phone with Oliver, she had no idea I was listening. I heard her saying, "Yes, I know. I'm trying. It's just harder than I thought." I never imagined I'd be the one to uncover the truth, But that evening, when Clara was in the shower, I found her journal. She had always kept a private one, but I never thought much of it. She had been writing in it more often lately, it seemed. I flipped through the pages, hoping for some sense of clarity. And there it was. A confession. Clara had written about how she'd been struggling to find balance between her work and personal life. How she felt that Oliver had been pushing her beyond her limits. How she was afraid of disappointing him. And then, her admission that he had been more than just a boss. More than just a mentor. "He's asking too much," she had written. "I feel trapped, like I can't say no. I'm doing things I shouldn't and I don't know how to stop it." I felt the world shift beneath me. It was as if a weight had been lifted from my chest, and at the same time, a new, heavier burden settled on my heart. This wasn't just about late-night meetings or business trips. This was something more. This was manipulation at its core. I didn't confront her immediately. Part of me wanted to give her a chance to explain herself, to come clean. But another part of me, an angrier, more betrayed part, wanted to confront her then and there. So, I waited. I sat with this newfound knowledge, feeling the slow burn of betrayal eating away at me, wondering how long it would take for her to finally face the truth of what she had been doing. The next day, I watched Clara go about her day like everything was normal. But inside, I knew better. Every time she smiled at me, I saw the guilt in her eyes. Every time she tried to make small talk, I felt the walls between us grow higher. It was that night when I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. I needed the truth. I waited for her to come home from yet another meeting with Oliver. As soon as she walked through the door, I didn't waste a second. I looked her straight in the eye and said, "Clara, we need to talk." She froze. There was a brief flicker of panic in her expression before she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "What's going on?" I held up her journal. "Tell me about this," I said, the words coming out colder than I intended. She gasped, clearly not expecting me to have found it. "But I didn't mean for you to see that," she stammered. I stood silent, watching her squirm. "How long, Clara? How long has this been going on?" The silence between us stretched, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw Clara as if she were a stranger. She slowly sank into a chair, her eyes brimming with tears. "I never wanted to hurt you. But he knows how to make me feel needed, wanted. And I've been afraid of losing everything. My career. Our relationship. It's so hard, Oliver knows what strings to pull." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Not yet. The depth of what had happened, what Oliver had done, was still settling in. I was just beginning to understand how deep his manipulation ran, how he had used Clara's ambition, her insecurities, against her. How far he had pushed her. And how far she had allowed herself to go. I could only stare at her. At the woman I thought I knew. The woman who had been lying to me for months. As the reality hit, I realized that the betrayal wasn't just between her and Oliver, it was between all of us. After Clara's confession, I felt a cold rage settle deep in my chest. I had known Oliver was manipulative, but I hadn't realized the extent of his control over her until now. His hold on Clara. His ability to use her ambition, her insecurities, against her, was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. But it wasn't just Clara he had affected. I started to realize how many others he had hurt, how many lives he had tangled with his lies and manipulations. And now it was time for me to act. I couldn't just sit back and let Oliver destroy everything. He had turned Clara into something she wasn't. Someone who was afraid of standing up for herself, afraid of losing what she had worked for. But he wasn't going to get away with this. Not without facing the consequences. I was determined to take him down. The first step was to gather evidence, and to do that, I had to look deeper into Oliver's life, his finances, his dealings, the toxic relationships he had built with his employees. I knew from Clara's accounts that Oliver was clever, ruthless even, and he hid everything behind layers of charm and professionalism. But charm could only take you so far. There were cracks in his empire. I just had to find them. I started by looking at Oliver's financial records. Clara had never spoken about his salary or the true scale of his business dealings, but I had a feeling he wasn't as clean as he liked to appear. I had to get my hands on the numbers. his bank statements, his tax filings, the transactions he'd made under the table. It took some time to find a way in, but once I did, the picture was clearer than I expected. Oliver had been laundering money through his business. There was no other way to explain the strange transfers and the frequent dealings with shell companies. He had also been siphoning off funds, diverting profits to his personal accounts, disguising them as expenses. I found proof of offshore accounts, hidden investments, and dubious transactions that all pointed to a pattern of financial corruption. Oliver had been using his company to cover up his personal greed. But it wasn't just the money that concerned me. It was how he treated people, how he manipulated everyone around him. I had heard rumors of employees who had left his company, disgruntled and terrified of speaking out, but I hadn't thought much of it until now. Clara had mentioned the names of some of these people, and it hit me. These were the same people who had been pushed aside, used up, and discarded. His toxic relationships with his employees were more than just bad management. They were a symptom of his abuse of power. I decided to reach out to some of the former employees. It wasn't easy. Most of them were afraid to speak out, terrified of Oliver's reach. But after a few conversations, I started to piece together what had really been going on in the company. Employees described Oliver as a master manipulator, charming when he wanted something, but cruel when he didn't. There were stories of him pressuring women into uncomfortable situations, using his position to coerce employees into doing things that were against their values, and even making threats if anyone dared to speak up. One of the most telling stories came from a woman named Sophia, an employee who had worked closely with Oliver in the past. She had been one of his closest confidants, but after a fallout, she had left the company. When I spoke to her, she didn't hold back. She described how Oliver had made her feel like she was indispensable, how he used her to climb the ranks while keeping her in check with promises of power, influence, and money. But when she finally pushed back, when she had the courage to confront him about his behavior, he turned on her. "He never respected me," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "It was all about control. All about using people. He's not the man he pretends to be. I saw him do things I can't even talk about. But I'm not afraid anymore. He can't hurt me now." Sophia's story gave me the final piece I needed. She told me about Oliver's patterns, the way he groomed people into believing they were special, only to use them until they were no longer useful. It was clear that Oliver's manipulation wasn't just about business. It was about power, control, and domination. He didn't just want success. He wanted to destroy anyone who got in his way. I knew I had to act fast. The evidence was piling up: financial corruption, toxic relationships, manipulative behavior. But the real question was how to use this information without it backfiring. Oliver had connections, power, and influence. I had to be careful. If I made one wrong move, it could all blow up in my face. I went back to Clara. By now, we had been dancing around the truth for too long. I had been gathering evidence for days, but it was time to confront her, to tell her what I had found. I needed her help. I needed her to understand that this wasn't just about their affair. It was about justice. "Clara," I said one evening after dinner, as we sat down in the living room. She looked at me warily, sensing the tension in the air. "I've been looking into Oliver," I continued. "Everything. His finances, his employees. I've found something. I think we need to talk about it." She went pale, and for a brief moment, I thought she might crumble right there. But she didn't. Instead, she nodded, almost mechanically. "I know," she whispered. "I know you've been suspicious. I never wanted you to find out like this, but I was scared. Scared of him, of what he might do if I left. But you're right. It's not just about me anymore." I could see the change in her. This was the Clara I knew, the strong, resilient woman who had been buried under Oliver's weight for so long. She was finally seeing the truth, and she was ready to help take him down. Together, we put a plan in motion. Clara would use her position to get closer to Oliver, to gather more information from him without raising suspicion. She was his confidant, the one person he trusted. If we could get more direct evidence of his corruption, we would have him cornered. Meanwhile, I would focus on Oliver's financials. There were still loose ends I needed to tie up, more transactions to trace, more documents to uncover. I started digging deeper into his offshore accounts, into his business dealings with shady partners, and into the ways he had been siphoning off money. I needed everything I could get, every piece of evidence that would make his financial empire crumble. The hardest part was dealing with the fear that came with this plan. We both knew that if Oliver caught wind of what we were doing, he would destroy us. He had done it to so many people before. But I couldn't back down now. I couldn't let him continue using people as pawns in his game. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, late-night meetings, and careful coordination. We had to move like ghosts, covering our tracks, making sure no one, least of all Oliver, caught on to our plan. Clara was doing her part, playing the role of the loyal assistant, while I continued to unearth the skeletons in Oliver's closet. The walls were closing in on him. One evening, as I was reviewing another set of financial documents I had gotten from a source inside Oliver's company, Clara walked in with the final piece of the puzzle, an email that Oliver had sent to a foreign bank, instructing them to transfer a large sum of money to one of his accounts. The email was incriminating, and it tied directly to the offshore accounts I had already uncovered. It was the evidence we needed. "We have him," Clara said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of relief and dread. "Now, we just need to make sure he can't escape." I nodded, the weight of what we were about to do settling heavily on my shoulders. The revenge plan was no longer a distant idea. It was real. It was happening. And it was going to change everything. The plan was taking shape faster than I had anticipated. Clara and I had gathered the evidence, the financial documents, the emails, everything we needed to bring Oliver down. But there was one crucial piece missing. A way to make sure he couldn't slip through our fingers, a way to get him to expose himself fully. That's when Lucas came into the picture. Lucas had been one of Oliver's former employees, someone who had been burned by him long ago. I had heard his name mentioned in the rumors that floated around the office, usually accompanied by whispers of someone who had left in a hurry, someone who had been pushed out. But what I didn't know at the time was how much Lucas had been hurt by Oliver, how deep the betrayal ran, and how much he wanted revenge. When I reached out to him, I wasn't sure what to expect. But when he agreed to meet, I knew that we had just gained a powerful ally. We met at a small, dimly lit cafe on the edge of town, somewhere far enough away from Oliver's radar, but close enough that it didn't feel like we were hiding. Lucas looked different than I had imagined. He was younger than I thought, early 30s maybe, with sharp features and a calculating gaze. His eyes were cold, and I could see the bitterness still lingering from the years he had spent under Oliver's thumb. "I don't need much," Lucas said as he sat down across from me, his voice low but steady. "I just want him to feel the same way I did when he threw me out like garbage. But I'll help you. You've got the goods on him, but you need more than just facts. You need him to slip up, to make a mistake. And I know exactly how to get him there." I didn't ask too many questions about what Lucas had been through. His story was irrelevant now. What mattered was that he hated Oliver enough to want to see him fall. "We've been tracking his finances," I said, leaning in. "We've got enough to ruin him, but we need to put him in a situation where he has no choice but to expose himself. If he doesn't realize what's happening, he might get away with it. We need him to make a move, something that will bring everything crashing down." Lucas smiled darkly, the corners of his mouth turning up slightly. "I can help with that. I've still got connections, people who owe me favors. I know how Oliver thinks, how he operates. He's arrogant. He thinks he's untouchable. If we can bait him with a fake deal, make him think he's got the upper hand, he'll make a mistake. Trust me." The plan was simple in theory, but dangerous in practice. Lucas knew the inner workings of Oliver's business better than anyone, and he had kept in touch with a few people who were still working under him, employees who, like him, had been mistreated and were now looking for a way to get even. Lucas proposed setting up a fake business deal, something that would appeal to Oliver's greed and arrogance. We'd get Oliver to believe that we were offering him a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, an investment deal that would promise millions in returns. All we had to do was manipulate him into thinking it was legitimate. "We set up a dummy company," Lucas explained. "We make it look like we're offering him a huge sum of money, a game-changing investment. He'll buy. And once he does, we'll have him. The deal will never happen, of course, but he won't know that. He'll go for it. And when he does, we'll have all the proof we need to expose him for the fraud he is. The plan hinged on one thing: Oliver's arrogance. He was so used to getting his way that he would never think twice about a deal that seemed too good to be true. He would never see it coming. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Lucas worked his connections, reaching out to a few former associates who could help fabricate the deal. They set up a fake company, complete with an official-looking website, fake financial statements, and even a list of investors who could vouch for the legitimacy of the deal. Clara helped with the logistics, setting up a private meeting with Oliver in a secluded location, far from prying eyes. She knew Oliver well enough to gauge when he would be most vulnerable, when he would be willing to take a risk. The first step was to get Oliver hooked. Clara arranged a lunch meeting with him under the guise of discussing a potential partnership, and she laid the groundwork. She spoke about a company she had been in contact with, one that was looking for a strategic investment. She painted the picture of a massive return on investment, something that would make Oliver's eyes light up. The next day, I received a text from Clara: "He's in. The meeting is set." The deal was ready to be set in motion. Lucas and I had a plan to infiltrate the meeting, to be present without Oliver realizing that we were already one step ahead. It was risky, but it was the only way to make sure Oliver didn't catch wind of what was going on. We had to make sure he thought the deal was as legitimate as possible. If he believed that everything was real, he would act impulsively, just like he always did. The meeting took place at a high-end hotel, in a private conference room far from the eyes of anyone who might question it. Clara greeted Oliver with her usual warmth, keeping him at ease, while Lucas and I waited just outside the door, listening in on the conversation. I could hear their voices as Clara explained the details of the deal, speaking with a calm authority that I had never seen in her before. She was good enough to make Oliver believe that this was his ticket to even greater power. She had him eating out of the palm of her hand. Then came the moment of truth. Clara excused herself, leaving Oliver alone with Lucas and me. The conversation shifted from business to something more personal. Oliver was eager to show us how much money he could make from the deal, boasting about his investments, his connections in the industry. His ego was inflated as always, and I could hear the arrogance in his voice. This was when we made our move. Lucas stepped forward, his voice smooth and calculated. "Oliver, we've been thinking. This deal is going to be huge. But we need a little reassurance. We need a commitment, something to show us you're serious about this." Oliver leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming. "Of course. I'm serious. You'll have everything you need. Just tell me how much you want to invest, and I'll handle the rest." At that moment, Lucas slid a piece of paper across the table, a contract that outlined the terms of the deal. It was completely fabricated, of course, but Oliver didn't know that. He signed it without hesitation, believing that he was securing his place at the top. He didn't even read the fine print. The deal was made. And as Oliver signed his name, he sealed his fate. We left the meeting quietly, knowing that the trap had been set. Clara rejoined us moments later, her face pale but satisfied. The deal was in motion, and Oliver had no idea that he had just signed his professional death warrant. We now had everything we needed to take him down. His signature, his commitment to a deal that was entirely fake, and the proof of his desperation to succeed at any cost. Oliver had fallen right into our hands. The rest was just a matter of time. As the plan against Oliver took shape, I began to realize that the battle wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone he had touched, everyone he had manipulated, and everyone who had been complicit in his rise to power. Among those people was Sophia, someone whose role in Oliver's web had been pivotal. She was the one who had been closest to him, the one who had once been a trusted confidant before everything fell apart. But in the grand scheme of things, she was also the perfect pawn in our game. And I knew exactly how to use her. Sophia was an obstacle. She wasn't just a victim of Oliver's manipulation, she was complicit in it. She had played a role in his rise, turning a blind eye to his actions, enabling him and benefiting from it. She had been the one who kept quiet about everything, who had never spoken out even after she left the company. She was just as guilty as he was. But unlike Oliver, Sophia didn't have the same level of power. She wasn't untouchable. I hadn't planned on going after Sophia at first, but as I watched Clara grow more and more distant from her, I realized that she had become a bigger problem than I had initially thought. Sophia still had ties to Oliver's world, and if she started to suspect what we were doing, she could sabotage everything. She was smart, and I knew she wouldn't just sit back and let us destroy Oliver without taking action of her own. I needed to neutralize her. And there was one way to do it: ruin her reputation. I hadn't counted on Emily, but when the idea hit, I knew she would be the perfect person to carry it out. Emily, Clara's close friend, was someone who had always been more than willing to lend a hand when it came to getting even. She had no love for Sophia. In fact, Clara had confided in me about the jealousy and rivalry that existed between the two women. Sophia's presence had always been a thorn in Emily's side. And now, with everything that had transpired, Emily saw an opportunity to settle old scores while simultaneously protecting herself from anyone who might come after us. It didn't take much convincing. Emily had always been good at manipulating situations, spreading whispers, and creating doubt in people's minds. She knew exactly how to plant a seed of suspicion and watch it grow. And with Sophia's career hanging in the balance, it was the perfect time to strike. I remember the first time I heard about it. Emily called me late one night, her voice smooth, almost too calm. "I've started spreading rumors about Sophia," she said. "Nothing too obvious, but just enough to make people question her. You know, stories about her relationship with Oliver, how she was always the one he trusted the most, and how some people have started to think that maybe she was more than just his assistant. There's talk about favoritism, about her being involved in some of his less-than-legal activities. At first, I wasn't sure if it was the right move. Clara had always spoken highly of Sophia, despite everything, and I wasn't sure if it would cause more trouble than it was worth. But Emily's words were convincing. The more she spoke, the more I realized that Sophia's reputation was something she held onto tightly. It was the one thing that kept her in the game, the one thing that gave her power in a male-dominated world. "People are already talking," Emily continued. "The whispers have already started. She's been seen hanging around certain shady people, and there are rumors about her personal life that people are starting to question. Once the doubt is there, it's easy to make it stick." I didn't need to hear any more. Emily was already on a roll, and it was clear that she was good at what she did. The more she could undermine Sophia's career, the more it would distract her from focusing on the bigger picture. If Sophia's professional life began to crumble, she would be too distracted trying to salvage her reputation to focus on the danger we had set up for Oliver. Over the next few weeks, things started to change. Sophia, who had once been one of the company's most influential figures, suddenly found herself the subject of office gossip. It started subtly, an offhand comment here and there, a knowing look exchanged between colleagues. But soon, the rumors grew louder. Whispers about her supposed special treatment from Oliver began to circulate in the office. People started to talk about her as though she had slept her way to the top, about how Oliver had always been overly protective of her, how they had a close working relationship. It wasn't long before these rumors reached the ears of the higher-ups, people who had always looked at her with suspicion but had never had the proof to act on it. The impact was swift. Sophia began to notice the shift in how people interacted with her. Colleagues who had once praised her suddenly avoided her, their smiles thin and polite. The men who had once flattered her now seemed to take pleasure in undermining her at every opportunity. A few of the women even started to make subtle comments, planting more seeds of doubt in her mind. It wasn't long before Sophia began to feel the pressure. Her response was predictable. She tried to fight back, tried to confront the rumors directly, but it was too late. By then, the doubt had already taken root. The more she tried to explain herself, the more people started to question her integrity. There were even anonymous emails sent to some of the higher-ups, suggesting that she was involved in unethical practices, things that only people who were truly close to Oliver would have known about. It was a classic case of reputation by rumor, and the consequences were becoming clear. Sophia's career began to falter. She was excluded from meetings, bypassed for important projects, and her influence in the company began to shrink. Her once strong position was crumbling under the weight of the whispers. Even some of her closest allies began to distance themselves, not wanting to get caught up in the scandal. But perhaps the most telling sign of her downfall came when she tried to reach out to Oliver. I overheard a conversation between Clara and Emily one evening, where Clara mentioned that Sophia had called Oliver multiple times, but he never returned her calls. He was ghosting her, leaving her to drown in the mess she had helped create. "It's like he's already moved on," Clara said quietly, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "She's got no one left to protect her." It was a bitter irony, really. Sophia had been one of the key people who had helped Oliver manipulate others, and now she was the one left out in the cold, her reputation destroyed and her career in tatters. As much as I hated what she had done, I couldn't deny that there was a certain cruelty in seeing her fall from grace so swiftly. The rumors that Emily had planted had worked. Sophia was no longer a threat. But it wasn't just about Sophia. It was a reminder to everyone else who had been involved with Oliver that they could be next. The stage was set. With Sophia's career on the line and Oliver still oblivious to the trap closing in on him, it felt like the pieces were falling into place. The game was almost over. It had been weeks since the plan was set into motion, and the walls were closing in on Oliver. He was still oblivious to the extent of the storm gathering around him. Sophia was on the brink of a professional collapse, his subordinates were beginning to lose faith in him, and the whispers of his underhanded dealings were beginning to reach the ears of people who had the power to make a difference. But that wasn't enough. We needed to expose Oliver's financial manipulations directly, to bring everything into the light in a way that would force the company and the authorities to act. The idea had always been clear: hit him where it hurt the most. His money, his wealth, his empire, was built on a foundation of deceit, embezzlement, and exploitation. He thought his dirty dealings were safely hidden, tucked away behind layers of corporate bureaucracy and shell companies. But he had underestimated how deep Clara, Lucas, and I were willing to go. The documents we had gathered, financial statements, bank transfers, emails, everything we needed, were damning. It was only a matter of presenting them in a way that would force an internal investigation, one that Oliver couldn't ignore. Clara had been instrumental in gathering the financial records. She had used her position to access files that were never meant to see the light of day, taking screenshots, downloading reports, and forwarding them to a secure location that only we could access. She was meticulous, careful. There were no mistakes. And she had been so thorough that I knew there was no way Oliver could talk his way out of this when the time came. Lucas, on the other hand, had been busy working behind the scenes to find the right connections. He knew people within the company, people who were disillusioned with Oliver but didn't have the courage to speak up. He used those connections to gather even more information, even more evidence that could further cement Oliver's guilt. It was a slow burn, but every piece of evidence we gathered made it harder for Oliver to hide. The next step was the most dangerous one: submitting the report. We couldn't afford to be seen, not yet. There were still too many people loyal to Oliver, people who would try to cover his tracks if they knew we were involved. I didn't want to risk Clara's safety, Lucas's, or mine. We needed to do this anonymously, in a way that would make it impossible for Oliver to trace back to us. I spent days drafting the report. It had to be perfect, every detail had to be accounted for, every piece of evidence had to be documented in a way that even the most skeptical person would be forced to act. We had to expose not only the financial manipulation but also the depth of Oliver's toxic relationships with his employees, the way he used his power to exploit them. I outlined everything: the shady contracts, the under-the-table deals, the kickbacks, the illegal transfers to offshore accounts. And then, I included the proof emails that connected him to fraudulent transactions, bank records that proved the flow of illicit funds, and testimonies from people who had been silenced by fear. It was a hard thing to write. I wasn't just exposing a man, I was tearing down the life that Clara and I had spent so long trying to build. But Oliver had left us no choice. He had destroyed our trust, and now we had to destroy him. The report was cold, clinical, and indisputable. I knew once it was out there, there would be no going back. Once the document was finished, we needed to ensure it landed in the right hands. We couldn't trust just anyone, and we couldn't afford to be traced. After much deliberation, we decided the best course of action was to send it through an anonymous whistleblowing platform, one that had been used in high-profile cases before, one that would ensure the information couldn't be traced back to us. Clara and I both agreed it was the safest way. The day I submitted it felt like a weight had been lifted. It wasn't just the document. It was the culmination of months of work, of emotional turmoil, of carefully planned steps that had led us to this point. I sat back and waited, watching the clock, waiting for the phone call, the email, the inevitable shift that would come. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that the fall was coming but not knowing exactly when. A week later, I got my first sign that the wheels were in motion. A news report broke about an internal investigation into the company. The headline was innocuous enough. Company under investigation for financial irregularities. But I knew that this was just the beginning. Behind the scenes, Oliver was already feeling the heat. Internal auditors were combing through the company's books, cross-checking every transaction, every email. People were talking. The whispers about his dealings, once dismissed as gossip, were now being taken seriously by the people who mattered. Sophia's downfall had been swift, but now Oliver's was unfolding in slow motion. He had never expected this. He thought he was invincible, untouchable, insulated from the consequences of his actions. But he had underestimated how much damage had already been done, how many people had been pushed to their breaking point. He had thought he could control everything, but the truth was slipping out of his hands faster than he could cover it up. It didn't take long for the first signs of panic to show. I was sitting in my office when I saw an email flash across my screen from an anonymous source, someone inside the company. The email was a simple one, but it said everything. Oliver is cornered. They're going to bring him down. The source had provided a few additional details, confirming that the investigation was widening and that people were now scrambling to cover their tracks. Oliver's closest associates were being questioned. The company was now under intense scrutiny, and no one knew where it would lead. Clara called me later that evening. Her voice was shaky, but there was a sense of satisfaction in it that I hadn't heard in a long time. "It's happening," she said. "They're actually looking into him. They've already started pulling records. They're questioning people about the deals he made, about the contracts he signed. It's only a matter of time before they get to the money. Once they do, it'll all come crashing down." It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold before me. The man who had once been untouchable, who had walked through the halls of the company with the confidence of someone who could never be caught, was now on the brink of losing everything. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the fact that Oliver had believed his power was permanent. He had thought that no one would ever dare challenge him. But Claire and I had. And now the wheels were turning, the investigation was underway, and Oliver's empire was starting to unravel. All we had to do now was wait for the next step. And I knew that, soon enough, Oliver's fall from grace would be inevitable. Goodbye.